Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. There's been so many new subscribers on the YouTube channel, and I'm so incredibly grateful for this. Many of you have reached out asking about who I am and about my research and about how I approach the study of pilgrimages. And so I thought it would be useful to spend some time going through a timeline of my research. And who doesn't love a timeline? I mean, really, who doesn't love a good timeline? So much of my research at the moment is focused on battlefield pilgrimages and pilgrimages to military cemeteries and war memorials and monuments. And a lot of people may not have the backstory about how I arrived at this current research. And I thought it would be helpful to spend some time looking back on the last 15 years of research and what has been a very meandering path to get me to where I am today. The current research on battlefield pilgrimages is steeped in a general study about the psychology of pilgrimages and really about the psychology of people who go on pilgrimages. So this podcast and my work overall has been titled and focused on the psychology of pilgrimage. And for many people, that is merely a phrase that prompts a question. Well, what is the psychology of pilgrimage? And so I'm going to talk about my views on what that is today. This overview by stating that this is just one psychology of pilgrimage. It's psychology of pilgrimage from my perspective. Over time, there are probably going to be many psychologies of pilgrimage in the same way that there are different anthropologies of pilgrimage. When I started this research, there wasn't a dedicated psychology of pilgrimage. And so that's where we really begin in being able to understand my research. There are a couple of factors that drew me into the interest in pilgrimages, which really started as a concrete interest when I was doing my PhD work at North Carolina State University. One stream that led into this greater pool was a number of travel experiences that I had had, both domestically in the United States, but also internationally, primarily in the decade of my 20s, where I traveled quite extensively in Asia and in Europe. And so a second stream that is tied to the travel is a longstanding interest in world religions. I grew up in a very small town in Wyoming, and it seemed like that the world was always out there beyond the horizon somewhere. And there was always something sort of drawing me into exploration and into travel and into being curious about how other people lived, what they did, how they worshiped God, how they engaged in other types of spiritual practices. And so the interest in world religions very much shaped this interest specifically in pilgrimages. A third stream informing my interest in pilgrimages is tied to my career as a mental health therapist. I worked for a number of years in practice with individuals and couples and families and groups. And through this work, I think I understood from a psychological standpoint the importance of what Victor Turner labeled as liminality. The concept of liminality is this idea that one is neither here nor there, and that can be in an outward social, structural type of way, but there's also a psychological liminality that occurs while people are in therapy, where they have left what was familiar and maybe questioning and maybe in an inflection or crisis point, and they're not yet arrived in that. And that liminal space was also recognized by many psychodynamic therapists as being the exact place where transformation occurs. And so the idea that pilgrimages are external journeys that are characterized by liminal space was something that was familiar to me as one who worked in a therapy practice. I also was noticing that mental health therapy, as we practice it and we conceptualize it, at least in the United States, can often be stagnant. And a therapist sitting across from patients or clients can feel stifling. It can feel claustrophobic. And for some people, it simply is not the right answer in order to to process trauma and other types of changes. And so I was having a lot of thoughts while I was working as a therapist that maybe there needed to be some other options for people, either in addition to or adjacent to talk therapy. And so I think the early seeds were placed there in terms of the idea that there are other activities that can be therapeutic for people. And maybe one of the roles of the therapist is to be a facilitator of these other activities that are outside of a therapy office. A fourth stream that I think really influenced my interest in pilgrimages is related to a number of personal experiences that I didn't realize were pilgrimages. I did not grow up in a religious tradition where pilgrimage was prioritized. And so it was actually not until I was doing my doctoral work that I started to read about and have an understanding about what pilgrimages were. And looking back on a number of experiences in my life, I then, at the time of being in the PhD program, could say that was a pilgrimage. I just didn't call it that. A couple of these experiences I think are notable, one of which I've already talked about on the podcast, which was a very formative experience that occurred when I was a student, an 8th grade student, or had just finished my 8th grade year. I participated in a trip to Washington, D.C., like many other students, and visited the Vietnam Wall and had an experience at the Vietnam Wall. Was quite transformational, and I didn't have the words to explain what happened during this experience, but that was definitely a pilgrimage, and it definitely set the stage for the work that I currently do related to the importance of battlefield pilgrimages and pilgrimages to cemeteries and war monuments and memorials. I think another aspect of my early life that has shaped where I am now is the fact that I descend from a long line of people who left their homes for whatever reason. Some because of economic reasons, others because of religious reasons. And all of these sort of converged in Wyoming, which is where I grew up. But I don't have longstanding connections to Wyoming. And so on both sides of my family and all of the branches that go out, our home, so to speak, is somewhere else. And so I think the idea that I am in a place where I feel like a stranger and I don't have strong connections set the tone for wondering, well, what was life before this point? My great-grandparents were immigrants from Hungary. And I remember talking to my grandfather over many years, and there was always a sense. I also remember I met my great-grandmother, and I remember her talking about this even when I was a young child, this idea that they wanted to return to the old country. And there was something about the old country that seemed to me like a more perfect world or a utopia or some place that if we could just return back to that, life would be wonderful. And so I think the seeds of longing to return to a place that I had not been myself, but that I had been in earlier generations, I think it was integral to my understanding of what it means to have this sense that I need to go away from where I am now, or I need to return to my homeland, or I need to return to something in order to find myself. As I prepared this slide presentation, I was thinking about how to divide my work into phases that would be helpful for listeners and viewers to understand. And so I am starting now with the PhD research because I think that is a natural place to start. And some of the results from that research are still relevant and applicable and almost more timely now than they were when I finished the PhD in 2013. So I'm going to be talking about the PhD dissertation. I'm going to be talking about fieldwork that I did during the era of my doctoral work. I'm going to talk about a theory that emerged from my research. I'm going to talk about how my research expanded in the realm of replication, but also across new methodologies and across new populations of pilgrims. After that, I'm going to talk about a couple of publications that really shifted my perspective in terms of recognizing the importance of bringing together a number of disciplinary perspectives to better understand pilgrimages that are happening currently, but also pilgrimages that have happened in the past. This emphasis on multiple disciplines and how fascinating it is to take the vast phenomena of pilgrimages and look at them in different ways led to an important anthology that I published in 2023. And so I'm going to talk about that. This also is the era of my Fulbright Award, which deepened my knowledge of a particular site, the site of Belleau Wood, and also of the pilgrims who visit there. And then this site and these pilgrims have continued to be a fascination and an inspiration. And so I'm going to talk about how I've taken even deeper dives into this site and into these pilgrimages and interviews with pilgrims, and also what I think it means and where I think it can be applied. I'll start with talking about the era of my dissertation. While I was in the midst of doing research for my dissertation, I started reading about the history of the Middle East for various reasons. And it was in one of these books by Bernard Lewis that I first encountered the word pilgrimage. And Lewis asserted that pilgrimage was important to all cultures in the Middle East. And he laid out the reasons why he made this claim. In his descriptions of the various pilgrimages, I actually saw a number of activities that I had engaged in and wondered at this point, was I a pilgrim when I was doing these different things in different places around the world? And it made me think, why have I never heard about pilgrimage within the mental health space? Why am I in a PhD after being a practicing therapist for a number of years, and I've never encountered pilgrimages when it seems like they are not only significant to the pilgrims, but the activities that are occurring, the practices that are occurring during the pilgrimages seem so transformational that it seems that we would need to have an understanding of what this means from a psychological standpoint, to be able to have a broader understanding of what pilgrimages are, what they mean to the pilgrims who are undertaking them. And also from a clinical standpoint, having an understanding of pilgrimage means we can better understand the patients and the clients that we're seeing in practice. And so I decided that I really wanted to learn more about pilgrimages. And one of the best places to do that is in Israel. Israel is the home to many different pilgrimage sites. Israel is a contested space. I think it can be argued that many places in Israel that may not be, in the top 3 or top 5 world religions are pilgrimage sites, even if they are not necessarily called that. And I'm going to demonstrate why in a moment. And so I decided that I wanted to do field work, observations and interviews in Israel. And I was finally able to procure a grant to do that in late 2010. These are 4 sites that are here on the screen that I visited. I visited other sites also, but I want to highlight these 4 because I think they demonstrate something that I was beginning to consider, which is that there seems to be something universal that is happening at pilgrimage sites, and I wanted to explore if that was the case, and if so, what was it? In Jerusalem, there are pilgrims everywhere. There are religious pilgrims, there are national pilgrims, there are military pilgrims. Pilgrimage is alive, it's bustling, it is dynamic in Jerusalem. And one of the places that was curious for me, where I talked to people, talked to pilgrims, and I sat and observed for several hours, was at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And what I was observing here were pilgrims. One group of pilgrims was coming from Nigeria, and they were all dressed similarly. On their clothing was an image of Jesus. And so all of the pilgrims could be easily identified as part of this same group because they were all wearing clothing that had an image of Jesus on it. And so they were moving together from site to site to site. They did not have a guide with them. It seemed like a guide, at least, that was coming from Jerusalem. There was what appeared to be a religious guide from their community who was explaining and interpreting what the sites meant. And so I remember being quite impressed by this group of pilgrims. Another situation that occurred while I was at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was I had come outside and I was sitting on a stone wall, and I noticed that there was a woman inside the area where the stone slab is. And on this stone slab, the woman was kneeled and her hair was very long, and she was moving her hair across the slab and she was weeping. And I was curious about what she was doing because there were people, other pilgrims and tourists walking around her. It was noisy, but it seemed like she was in her own world at this site. And I was particularly curious about this because I did not have a connection to the site in that way. I did not have a connection to the stone slab in the same way that she did. And I was not in a frame of mind where weeping was the way that I was going to express myself. And so I was curious how one person could be at this place, this sacred place, and others were busily walking around, and I was an outside observer, and I didn't experience the site in the same way. And so I noted that. Same site, different responses. I also went to Masada, which is a hilltop near the Dead Sea, right by the Dead Sea. And it's a pilgrimage site for a number of different groups. One of those groups is recruits from the Israel Defense Force. And there was a group of young people there who were in uniform. It was notable because I saw a couple of the soldiers were wearing Hello Kitty backpacks, and I remember thinking, this is so very different than what soldiers would be wearing from the United States. And so Masada is a place of national pilgrimage that reinforces the identity, the national identity of being Israeli, as well as a place where soldiers declare that never again will the people of Israel be overtaken. I talked with Shay Rabineau in another episode about this, and if you're interested in that, he's much more knowledgeable than I am about this, and so you can check out that episode. Another place that I visited was the Latrun battlefield, which is basically an open-air tank museum. And it's the site of a number of military conflicts throughout time. And what made this notable to me is that while I was there, I was sitting on another stone. There were lots of stones that I sat on while I was in Israel. And I was on this very large boulder, and I turned, something caught my attention from the periphery, and I turned and saw two older men with their arms around each other, pointing. They were crying and they were drinking a bottle of vodka, or I assumed it was something similar. It was clear. And I realized that they were there talking about when they had been soldiers there. And they were returning for reasons that I pondered and which I still ponder. And this site in Israel was the place where I realized there's something about battlefield pilgrimages that are significant, especially significant for those soldiers who fought in that place, to come back and to process what had happened there. And I see that now in the work that I'm doing around the pilgrimages that occurred after World War I, which I'll be getting to momentarily. The fourth site that I went to was important not because I visited the actual pilgrimage site. There is a Baha'i site in Haifa that is the World Pilgrimage Center, and I had not adequately prepared to be able to visit. I think anyone can visit the site, but I had not sent in information to be able to visit the site. What I did encounter were pilgrims. pilgrims staying in a hostel where I stayed for a couple of days, had a number of conversations with those pilgrims. And what struck me is how pilgrims formed communities. Many of them were young people coming from around the world. Some of them were staying for an extended period of time and they were volunteering at the site, and others were there on a pilgrimage. Some had just become part of the Baha'i community, and the pilgrimage was part of their spiritual formation, their identity transformation. And what I learned from these pilgrims is the importance of the community and the fact that they identified first as Baha'i pilgrims over and above being from Australia or the United States or Canada. And I also learned about hospitality in this hostel because I spent a number of hours talking to the people who own the hostel about what they're doing, and how they're supporting the pilgrim community and the importance of creating a space that feels like home for these pilgrims. What I took away from this field work is the idea that sites remain constant, pilgrims do not, and also that it seemed that whether it was in Jerusalem with all the different types of pilgrims that I saw, or at the Latrun battlefield, or at Masada, or in Haifa, people at the core were seeking meaning and they were seeking connection. And there was a universality that I recognized that seemed important. I didn't fully understand it at the time, but it seemed that the pilgrimages are practices or endeavors that are universal regardless of who is doing it or where they're doing it. I also observed as I sat and watched pilgrims go through their pilgrimages that it seemed that many of them were on an arc. There was a preparation. I didn't know about the preparation before they had arrived, but there was like a secondary preparation before they entered the sacred space. Then there was the activity that occurred within the space, and then there was the retreat after. And that set the stage for deeper exploration around the developmental arc of a pilgrimage. After I returned from Israel and processed and reflected and wrote about my observations and experiences, started to delve more into the academic literature on pilgrimages and realized that there was a psychological and mental health gap in that literature. There isn't a gap in pilgrims talking about their psychological processes, and there isn't a gap necessarily in the way anthropologists have written about pilgrimage as it pertains to psychological variables, because pilgrims have always talked about it and written about in their memoirs, in their reflections about the psyche, their own psyches. But what I did discover is that the psychological literature had largely ignored pilgrimages, and there was only one text that I found that had systematically addressed the idea of mental health and psychological factors, which was, I think, the handoff, and I'll explain in a moment what I mean by that. So, in addition to the lack of literature from a psychological lens, there was also no clinical vocabulary. So I looked at applied psychological literature. So looking into what are mental health practitioners saying about pilgrimages, and I could not find any solid sources on how mental health practitioners were engaging pilgrimages, either engaging them conceptually or how they were working with their patients or clients who had gone on pilgrimages. So, as I said, the existing literature really described what happened, and most of this is derived from pilgrims' memoirs. Pilgrims were not reflecting on the psychological mechanisms for what was occurring within. And ultimately, psychology journals, the academic journals, were largely absent from the pilgrimage scholarship. I did, as I just mentioned, find one volume which was edited by Michael Winkelman and Jill Dubish, entitled Pilgrimage and Healing, and it is a fantastic exploration of pilgrimages and healing. And in this volume, Dubish and Winkelman, as well as the authors who contributed chapters, did address mental health ideas and concepts. They were doing so from an anthropological standpoint. Many of these writers are medical anthropologists, and I saw this volume as the handoff, the baton that I needed to bring this idea of healing and health and pilgrimages into the psychological domain. And so I had three main research questions that guided my exploration. I wanted to know what motivates individual people, individual pilgrims to undertake a pilgrimage. What's driving them? Are they at a crisis point? Are they grieving? Are they experiencing a recent breakup? Are they at a career transition point? I found out all of those can be motivators. I wanted to understand what psychological processes occurred during the journey, and I wanted to frame all of this within this therapeutic apparatus. So I wanted to understand what is the therapeutic value of the pilgrimage experience. I decided to use a constructivist grounded theory methodology for my research, for the primary research study. And I did so because I was looking to establish a new theory around this therapeutic value construct. The methodology to me was so well aligned because it allowed me to get straight into the lived experiences of the pilgrims and then to co-create meaning from the pilgrims' experiences. So I interviewed 10 participants. 5 self-identified as religious pilgrims. The other 5 said they were secular pilgrims across several different types of pilgrimages, which I categorized in 4 groups. I did semi-structured interviews with all of the pilgrims. These were multi-hour interviews. I asked open-ended questions. There were multiple rounds per participant. Then I took those interviews, had them transcribed. At this point, this is well before AI, and so I hired someone to transcribe. Most of the interview transcripts were 150 pages. And the first step of a good grounded theory protocol is the transcripts get sent back to the participants to review and to offer additional commentary, reflection, and then they are retranscribed if needed. There were 2 pilgrims in my sample that wanted to clarify a couple of points, but by and large, our time together captured the essence of their particular pilgrimages. There's a 4-level coding protocol with this particular methodology, and so it's a coding funnel, which I'll describe a little bit more in a few minutes. And as I said, I selected this particular methodology because I wanted to co-create this theory with the pilgrims themselves rather than me taking a distant view and imposing what I believe to be the truth of their experience onto them. So we worked together quite extensively as I developed this theory. The code funnel for a constructivist grounded theory methodology starts with codes, which are basically themes that are identified in the transcript. So the transcript is read line by line, and important themes are noted for students who are listening. They can be noted in a track changes or written down. Those codes are extensive. And so this process gives the researcher the opportunity to dig deeply into the thematic codes within a pilgrim's experience and within the pilgrim's data, and also across the sample. So there's depth as well as breadth in this type of methodology. So those initial codes for each pilgrim were then further reduced to what's called focused codes. So these are higher order categories that emerge across the participants. Then the next layer of coding is starting to create some very specific codes that encapsulate the structure of the experience. And then the last code is called a theoretical code. And the theory that emerged from the data is that pilgrimage is a therapeutic process. So that was the key to the research. Through the interviews and the coding, it was kind of whittled down through this funnel into a theory that pilgrimage is a therapeutic process. I'm going to get into explaining the theory in a moment, but I just wanted to touch on some other data that came out of this research pertaining to what was motivating these pilgrims. They were seeking meaning. They were seeking answers, a framework for suffering, a framework for constructing meaning out of crisis. Many of them were coping with grief in some way, either grief from early childhood, relational grief, loss of a parent, etc. And pilgrimages offer a socially sanctioned structure for mourning. The pilgrims were also engaged in identity formation, and the journey accelerated the sense of who they are and were becoming. They experienced connection to something sacred, to God, a divine energy, others, to the self. They experienced deep connection with other pilgrims, which Victor Turner and Edith Turner labeled as communitas. They experienced transformation. They did not return the same as when they left. Their pilgrimage experience reorganized how they saw the world, and ultimately the pilgrims experienced healing across biological, across psychological, social, and spiritual domains. Here are a few of their own words. Saeed was a Hajj pilgrim, and he said to me, "It is like when I was a boy in Egypt, and I would have a fight with my parents. I would run to my grandmother's house, and she would comfort me. That is what pilgrimage is. When there is stress in the world, you can run to the house of God and you will be comforted." Alcuin was a pilgrimage to Chimayo in New Mexico. And he said, it's a touchstone. So I remember exactly where I am, who I am, what I am. So that's the importance of it for me. Mike was a pilgrim who went to a monastery, and Mike was a Protestant, but the monastery was Catholic, and he had a lot of insights around what it was like to experience a religious context that felt different from his own. He said it was therapeutic in the way that it kind of helped me see different ways to deal with my own stress, or help me to figure out what my priorities are and what the distractions are, I guess, in life. Wild Bill was a Vietnam veteran who participated in the Run for the Wall, which is an annual motorcycle pilgrimage to the Vietnam Wall. He said, if you know how to read the imagery, you would know who you were around very quickly, The necklace that I wear it's the colors of the ribbon that you wear on your uniform from people that have served in Vietnam. So anybody who has that ribbon, would understand what that means. So the imagery, the tattoos, the symbols that you wear probably speak for you. And he consistently spoke about what it meant to be part of the group, an insider within this pilgrimage group. The emergent theory of this constructivist grounded theory research is that pilgrimage is therapeutic across 4 integrated domains. From a biological standpoint, the primary mechanisms are walking, eating, and praying as embodied physical acts. Walking engages the body in sustained, purposeful physical effort that challenges endurance while simultaneously connecting pilgrims to the landscape. Communal eating operates as a bonding ritual that nourishes both body and social connection. Praying functions as a repeated, rhythmic physical practice. Notably, these are not incidental activities, but central, intentional components of the pilgrimage structure, suggesting the body itself is the vehicle for transformation. Pilgrimage is also therapeutic in the psychological domain, and this domain had the richest set of mechanisms. They cluster into several processes. Meaning making allows pilgrims to construct new narratives around grief, loss, identity, or belief. Recalibration through reflection, gaining perspective, and figuring out priorities creates a kind of psychological reset, with the pilgrimage acting as a temporal marker that separates before from after. Comfort and belonging arise through feelings of being welcomed, being cared for, and connecting with ancestral or spiritual heritage. Contrasting one's ordinary life with the pilgrimage experience generates awareness of what matters. Finally, witnessing serendipitous or synchronistic events produces a felt sense of meaning and purpose beyond ordinary life. Pilgrimage is also therapeutic in a social domain. These mechanisms center on co-creation of identity and community. Group identity formation through shared symbols, rituals, dress, and hardship creates a powerful sense of solidarity amongst strangers. The homecoming motif, particularly for ancestral pilgrimages, activates a deep sense of belonging that transcends individual biography. Generational legacy emerged as a distinct mechanism, with pilgrims moved by witnessing multiple generations engaging the same sacred practices. Participants also found meaning in being an ambassador or a holy messenger, giving back to others at the site and participating in shared ritual structures. Even pilgrims who intended to travel alone universally encountered and were transformed by social connection. Pilgrimage is therapeutic within a spiritual domain. I think this will come as no surprise, considering pilgrimages have historically been tied to religious practice. The spiritual mechanisms, though, largely operated through and within the other three domains. So this is something that's interesting. So rather than a fully separate process, the therapeutic value is operating through the other three domains, connecting with God, engaging in sustained prayer, and ritually contrasting one's own tradition with that of others all produce spiritually therapeutic effects. A distinctive finding was that the pilgrimage anti-structure, Turner's concept of stepping aside or outside of ordinary social roles and hierarchies, created space for spiritual openness. This was evident in participants like Pilgrim Christine, who was a self-described lapsed Catholic who found herself attending church multiple times, and in Said's observation that the Hajj dissolved social distinctions entirely. I was also interested to, in a cursory way, explore the difference between religious and secular pilgrims. And from the sample, what differed between these two self-identified groups is that religious pilgrims draw on doctrinal frameworks, secular pilgrims construct meaning individually. So the language differs. But what doesn't differ is the transformation that occurs. The identity piece is prominent in both types of pilgrimages, communitas, and healing. The therapeutic structure is consistent across traditions. So one of the conclusions then that emerges that I had been interested in clear back when I was in Israel observing pilgrims and then speaking to dozens of pilgrims, and then formally the 10 pilgrims that were included, their in-depth experiences were analyzed. All of this points to the fact that pilgrimage is a psychological universal. It's present in all human traditions, and it's not the property of any one faith. After finishing the PhD, I took an academic position at the University of Southern Queensland in Toowoomba, Australia. And during the time that I was at USQ, I had the wonderful opportunity to supervise 5 students who were completing their honors thesis. And we collectively took the BPSS framework from my PhD research and decided to use it as the framework for 5 different studies. Rather than using constructivist grounded theory, we decided that interpretive phenomenological analysis was more useful and appropriate for the type of research that these students were doing and the time frame that they were doing it in. Interpretive phenomenological analysis is a fantastic methodology. I've used it many times since this point, and it is a stepwise thematic analysis that was developed by Smith, Flowers, and Larkin. And so the BPSS framework was extrapolated in the sense that the semi-structured interview protocol, which I had developed, was used in all 5 of these research studies, and each one used IPA in a different setting with different types of pilgrims. It became obvious in early conversations with my colleagues in Australia, as well as with these students, that the construct therapeutic value may not be appropriate within an Australian context. And so we decided to shift the focus to well-being, which for all intents and purposes meant the same thing, but the terminology was more culturally appropriate. And so one student looked at spiritual well-being outcomes. She was very interested in only the spiritual side of pilgrimages for Australians, and the group of pilgrims that she interviewed and was looking at were those who had walked the Camino. Another student also was looking at the Camino as the constant, but looked at well-being amongst Australian women pilgrims. Another student interviewed pilgrims that self-identified as pilgrims who visited Gallipoli during the centenary commemoration in 2015, and her work looked at national identity. Another student looked at long-distance walking, but walkers who self-identified as pilgrims, and she was looking at the well-being outcomes of these long-distance walks. And the last student looked also at long-distance walkers, but who self-identified as pilgrims, but they were specific to the Bibbulmun track, and looked at well-being amongst those pilgrims. So the results of all of their studies mirrored the grounded theory study, which was incredible. The themes were nearly identical. And so this further validated the BPSS theory in a qualitative sense. At the same time that I was supervising these honors theses, I was part of a conference, the Sacred Journeys Conference, which that year occurred in Prague in the Czech Republic. And we decided to publish the papers as an edited volume, and along with Kate Hetherington, who was one of my honors students, we published the papers under the title Pilgrimage as Transformative Process. The framework for this volume was the idea that pilgrimages are vehicles of movement from fractured to integrated. They're containers for moving from grief and disorientation and other types of fractures towards an integration of the self. In addition to the notion that pilgrimages are therapeutic in biopsychosocial spiritual domains, or that they lead to greater well-being in biopsychosocial spiritual domains, the research studies that I was supervising with my honors students also reflected this developmental arc. For each of the pilgrims talked about how they had decided to go on a pilgrimage long before they actually went, how they prepared, what was important around the departure and their actual journey, and what happened when they arrived at the pilgrimage site, and what happened as they stayed or remained within that site, and then what happened when they returned, and then how they integrated, or maybe how some of them weren't integrating the pilgrimage. And so this developmental arc was seen again and again and again across pilgrimage sites and across pilgrims. David Gitlitz and Linda Davidson influenced my perspective on the developmental stages of the pilgrimage process. They wrote about a basic stage process in one of their volumes. They did a 2-volume series of pilgrimage, and I expanded upon this and published a chapter in Pilgrimage's Spiritual Practice, a handbook for teachers and guides, which was published in 2022. Ann Olson in Macintosh and Dane Monroe reached out to me probably in late 2021, early 2022, and asked if I would write a chapter for their new volume, which was focused on new pilgrimage routes and trails. And I decided to take the opportunity to explore a trail that I had learned about called the Western Front Way, which was being mapped along the trench lines of World War I. And this publication changed so much for me. And I'm so grateful that they asked me to write the chapter, and not only write it, but also in doing so, it gave me the opportunity to delve more deeply into an area that has inspired me and propelled me forward in an area that I continue to research today. I learned about this new trail called the Western Front Way and had the opportunity to interview the director of the organization that was mapping the trail, as well as pilgrims who had either been guides along the trail or were pilgrims themselves. And the basic gist of this trail is that there was a British soldier who wrote home in 1915 while he was at the front. And he wrote to his parents talking about where he was and how he had envisioned after the war that it would become a path of peace and that families would visit, and that this landscape of war and destruction and violence would turn into something peaceful. And so an organization in Great Britain decided to take Gillespie's vision and map a path. While I was writing this chapter and researching the pathway, I realized that one of the American sites that is an important pilgrimage site, an important site of memory for the war, called Belleau Wood, was not on the path. And so I wrote a bit about why I thought it was important that this site become a connected point along the path. And I also bumped into something that changed my life. And those of you who have been around me know all about my fascination with guidebooks that were printed after World War I, after the First World War. There were a series of guidebooks that were published that were for pilgrims visiting these sites. And I learned that people were coming to these sites as pilgrims, not as tourists, although some were, but a vast majority of them were pilgrims. And these interwar guidebooks laid out routes, they interpreted landmarks, they described military actions, and they were taken by pilgrims to these former sites of war as they walked different routes or traveled in cars, or some of them cycled along these places that had been destroyed during the war. En masse, thousands of veterans went back to the Western Front on pilgrimages during the years in between the two world wars. Many families came on pilgrimages to these sites. They were visiting graves or looking for their loved ones. There were religious activities that happened as part of these pilgrimages. The U.S. government funded pilgrimages for mothers and some wives who had lost their sons or husbands in the war. And so I was completely overtaken with fascination by these interwar pilgrimages. And so this chapter, I think, was one of the critical pieces of writing and eras of research that gave way to where I am now. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in a moment about that. Along the same time, I was reflecting on all of these wonderful colleagues that I have around the world who study pilgrimages and write about pilgrimages. And I was thinking about how we come from very different disciplinary lenses and frameworks, and that I was interested in learning more about the history of each discipline and why pilgrimage sort of was a natural outgrowth of the history of the discipline, and how the discipline viewed pilgrimages and the types of research that were going on. And so I thought it would be interesting to pull together a book, an edited volume on all of these different types of perspectives on pilgrimages, and one, so that we can learn from each other about our disciplinary frameworks, but also there's so much cross-disciplinary or transdisciplinary collaboration that it makes sense to be able to have a solid understanding of where we're all coming from as we collaborate on various pilgrimage research or applied pilgrimage work. So 12 disciplines are represented in this volume. I am the editor of the volume, and also this was the first volume in a new series, a book series. I was asked to be the founding series editor of Pilgrimage Studies, which is published by Peter Lang, and this was the first volume that we published. We're up to 4 volumes now. And I also wrote a chapter on psychology perspectives on pilgrimage. The chapter centers on the idea that there are 4 aspects, or I've identified 4 aspects, there are probably more, that shed light on psychology and psychological approaches and psychological motivations, and this intersection of where psychology and pilgrimage overlap. So there's historical pilgrimage literature that may focus on pilgrims describing what happens while they're on pilgrimages, what their inner thoughts are, what their motivations are, what their emotional responses are. There is some psychology literature on pilgrimage, although it's very small, which I mentioned earlier, almost non-existent. Non-psychology pilgrimage literature that sheds light on psychological processes, such as Pilgrimage and Healing, the volume by Jill Dubish and Michael Winkelman, the volume that Jill Dubish and Michael Winkelman edited. Some of that psychology literature that's relevant to pilgrimages is focused on social identity theory. The theory itself applies to pilgrimage. Abraham Maslow wrote about pilgrimages as peak experiences, and also self-determination theory is another theory of motivation that applies to pilgrimages. Personal construct theory, which was articulated and written about by George Kelly, finds resonance with pilgrimage psychology, and I wrote about it in my dissertation. And then narrative psychology, which is a growing body of research. I included recommendations for the field, as did other authors, but my recommendations included that I think psychologists need to be co-authors. If authors are talking about psychological concepts, it's helpful to have someone with psychological expertise. I think we need to be publishing more in psychology journals. We need to develop a taxonomy. I want to further investigate the concept of eudaimonic well-being. We need more research on virtual pilgrimages and how people are engaging and what their motivations are and their responses to virtual sites. And I think we need to prioritize research on pilgrim identity. The next segment of my work was an incredible year as a Fulbright scholar in France. I was hosted by Stéphane Michonneau at the University of Lille. I was in the lab for at the lab, the Institute for Historical Research of the North. And I was able to spend this year doing fieldwork, interviews, delving into archives in both the United States and France, which is an outcome of both the Western Front Wave chapter that I had written, as well as the multidisciplinary perspectives on pilgrimage volume. I saw a greater need in my own work to engage archival materials, particularly because I was looking at post-war pilgrimages to Belleau and Belleau Wood, and so many of these pilgrimages occurred in the 1920s and 30s. And so it was important for me to find primary sources that describe the pilgrimages. That's been a wonderful addition to my work. As I just mentioned, I engaged in archival research. I was able to locate photos and scrapbooks and correspondence that pilgrims wrote. I also located the interwar guidebooks. I've become a collector of them. I reviewed the cemetery visitor registries from the En Marne American Cemetery, which is in Belleau. I conducted interviews with battlefield guides and pilgrims and staff of the cemetery, local inhabitants. If I was at En Marne American Cemetery or in Belleau and I saw people, I was talking to them. I wanted to hear all about their experiences and why they were there and what they were hoping would happen. And as time went on, I was more and more heartened to hear that people were calling their visits pilgrimages. And so that's an interesting development, actually. I also spent a lot of time as I just said, in the cemetery, inside the wood, the villages, and have talked with so many people, probably hundreds of people at this point. The specific sites of study were the Belleau Wood battlefield itself, the cemetery, the Devil Dog Fountain, which is in the village of Belleau, and St. Stephen's Church in Belleau. Another outcome of my Fulbright was that I organized a conference in collaboration with my Fulbright host, Professor Stefan Michonneau, and our colleague, Dr. Frank Wiltart. This conference occurred in 2023. It was convened in 2 locations, one in the Chemin des Dames and in Chateau Thierry, which are 2 significant Western Front pilgrimage landscapes. The conference pulled together academics and practitioners from different fields, and the focal point was pilgrimages that had occurred to the Western Front after World War I. We conducted the conference in both French and English, and it was a really interesting and wonderful experience. The geographic scope of the conference was the entire Western Front of the First World War, and there were academics and practitioners from the United States, France, Belgium, and Canada. And the academics were from history, psychology, sociology, anthropology, and heritage studies. The primary goal of this conference was to situate battlefield pilgrimage within the broader framework of pilgrimage studies beyond military history alone. Battlefield pilgrimages, especially those that occurred between the 2 world wars, have been written about by military and cultural historians and other historians. But my goal for this conference was to make the case that these pilgrimages that were occurring and are still occurring in even greater numbers after 2018 in particular, are pilgrimage iterations that are similar to other types of pilgrimages. And so we're taking the phenomena of pilgrimages that occurred during this historical moment, and we are looking at them through the lens of a pilgrimage studies framework and not solely a historical framework. This conference led to the publication of a volume in my series Pilgrimage Studies with Peter Lang. The volume was organized around 3 areas: the pilgrimage sites, the pilgrims, and the practices. And I think, as I have said in other podcast episodes and in other writings about this volume, I think where the volume makes the most significant contribution is in exploration of the practices that differentiate pilgrims from other types of travelers. My chapter is on the Belleau Wood battlescape, and I look at the concept of affordances as it pertains to pilgrims. I'm not going to go into too much depth here because I've talked about it in other episodes on this podcast. I did want to just give a shout out here to both Stefan Michonneau and to Frank Wiltart, who were wonderful collaborators in this project. Another publication where I explored battlefields as sacred sites was published by Army Magazine, and it was aptly entitled Battlefields as Sacred Sites. It addressed a couple of issues in this publication. The primary motivation for this piece was to report on the accounts that I was hearing from pilgrims, especially at Enmarn American Cemetery. I've conducted, as I said, probably hundreds of interviews at this point, and some common themes have emerged from those interviews at Belleau Wood. One motivation is that veterans are visiting battle sites because they're coping with grief. Gold Star families are visiting military cemeteries also because they're coping with grief, and their grief finds form in the journeys to these sites. Other pilgrims are visiting the sites because they want to connect with the past. One common theme that seems to continue to bubble up in conversations on this podcast is about how the pandemic was the impetus for many people connecting with their family heritage and history through genealogical searches or through discoveries of documents in their parents' attic, for example. And so that has led to an increase in the travel to battlefields and to cemeteries and war memorials after the pandemic, as people want to connect with the landscape that they had read about or learned about during the pandemic. Another reason that people are traveling to battlefields on pilgrimages is to make meaning of war. And that has been occurring since 1918, at least for the First World War. And it has continued at battlefields all over the world throughout time. Another publication that is forthcoming this year is an expansion of the work that I did on psychology perspectives of pilgrimage for my 2023 volume. This chapter is going into the Sage Handbook of the Psychology of Religion and Spirituality. And this chapter is important because it positions the psychology of pilgrimage as an established area of psychological science and makes the case that pilgrimage is a core topic within the psychology of religion and spirituality. I also just published an essay called Landscapes of Commemoration, Collections of Remembrance, which delves into my collection of post-World War pilgrimage medals and guidebooks. And also, I have just recently acquired a memoir that was an insider account of the 1927 American Legion pilgrimage, which I'm to republish soon. One of the primary pilgrimage sites in the Belleau Wood battlescape is the Devil Dog Fountain, and I have spent years researching the fountain itself, the pilgrims, the Marines that visit this fountain, what it means, why it's important, how it's evolved. And so my latest article was just published a few weeks ago in Marine Corps History. The first article was published in 2024, but the second article is a deep dive. I'm in the weeds in this article, and it was a really interesting article to write, and further cements the Belleau Wood battlefield, but the fountain in particular, as a pilgrimage site. One of the challenges that I have found in my research leading up to the Western Front Way paper that I previously mentioned is that my research has been quite broadly focused on the psychology of pilgrimage. And it's been challenging to ground that work in a particular site. And so I have so appreciated the opportunity over the past couple of years to be able to do field work and so many interviews and historical research on these sites of memory that are in France. The dissertation work, the honors theses that I supervise and was part of in terms of the research, data collection, and thematic analysis, my publications, the Fulbright research, and deepening the research in a particular site in Belleau Wood and in the village of Belleau have led to returning to the basic premise. Pilgrimage is a therapeutic practice that leads to enhanced well-being. The 2013 dissertation asked how are pilgrimages therapeutic? The theory that emerged was that they are therapeutic across biological, psychological, social, and spiritual domains. 15 years of fieldwork, archival research, and publications have grounded the therapeutic claim in historical practice and applied context. In all of this, I continue to say people go on pilgrimages to heal, and they always have. My research on battlefield pilgrimages will continue. I feel like I'm only getting started. I'm only scratching the surface. There's so much more to learn. The next phase of my research extends this idea that pilgrimages are therapeutic in a biological, psychological, social, and spiritual sense. And I want to better understand what happens when pilgrims visit sites of war and memory. Right now, my primary site is Belleau Wood, but I'm interested in other sites of war and memory, other conflicts. I'm interested in how people engage with battlefields, with monuments and memorials, with military cemeteries across time, across nations, across iterations of pilgrimage, and ultimately what draws us to these places. Humans have always made pilgrimages to sites of suffering, to sites of sacrifice, and to sites of memories. They've gone to battlefields, to cemeteries, to monuments, and to the ground where others died. The drives that bring these pilgrims to sites of war and memory are universal. The drives that bring pilgrims to these types of sacred sites, such as the longing for meaning, the need to grieve, the desire for connection across time, mirror the drives that bring pilgrims to other sacred sites. In addition, sharing stories about pilgrimages connect us. When pilgrims speak about their transformation, when they speak about the meaning that is created by visiting sites, when they speak about how their identity changes because of being a pilgrim, they're connecting with millennia of other pilgrims across divides, across religious barriers, across political barriers, across class barriers, across racial barriers. This sharing stories, sharing experiences, sharing expertise on pilgrimages. This is why I created this podcast. The psychology of pilgrimage is about people. The psychology of pilgrimage is about pilgrims. It's about those deeply ingrained quests for meaning that we all share. Ultimately, my work and the psychology of pilgrimage is about creating a more peaceful world by understanding what connects us.